A very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the session. BA History Program, second semester, session number 36. I am Sudhaji, Assistant Professor, Department of History, GFGC, Ripanpet. Before beginning the session, let me ask you a general knowledge question. Have you ever heard about Kalistan Movement? If yes, where did Kalistan Movement take place and why did it occur? Can you tell me? Yes, you are right. The Kalistan Movement is a Sikh separatist movement started in early 1980s seeking to create a homeland for Sikh by establishing a sovereign state called Kalistan, the land of Khalsa in Punjab. Like Sikh people, who was the Mughal emperor, tried to transform India into a land of Islam, Darul Islam. Your response is right. He was Aurangzeb. Today, in this session, let us explore the religious policy of Aurangzeb. Students have learnt about causes and consequences of Deccan policy of Aurangzeb. They also knew about the enemies encountered by Aurangzeb in the south. Learning objectives of today's session: to enable the students to know about the nature of religious policy of Aurangzeb, to make them understand the impact of his religious policy on Mughal Empire. Learning outcome of today's session: at the end of the session, students will feel sorry for the miserable conditions of Hindus. They will recall the people who rebelled against his policy of persecution. They will locate the places on the outline map of India where revolt took place. They will analyze how his religious policy became responsible for the downfall of the Mughal Empire. Let us start with the introduction. Being a fanatic Sunni Muslim, Aurangzeb wanted to transform the land of infidels, that is Darul Harb, into land of Islam, Darul Islam. He reversed the policy of religious toleration of Akbar, which was an unfortunate thing. His aim was to promote tenets of Islam and to ensure that the people led their life accordingly. Aurangzeb believed in the Islamic theory of kingship and sovereignty, which enjoins the ruler to enforce the Quranic law in the administration of his state and to convert his country from a heathen land into the land of Islam. Aurangzeb did not like Deen Ilahi and its principles introduced by Akbar. Therefore, he wanted to do away with the innovation of Akbar. Let us move on to know the measures taken to implement his religious policy. Aurangzeb imposed political, economic, and social disabilities on the non-Muslims so as to remind them every day of their inferiority and to force them to abandon their ancestral religion and become converts to the Muslim faith. Among the measures introduced were anti-Hindu measures. He demolished temples and broke the idols. For this purpose, muhtasibs and darogas were appointed. They have to supervise the destruction of the temples in India. He also replaced temples by mass. He demolished the temples in Mathura, where we have Keshav Dev temple, and Varanasi. He demolished Vishwanath temple, Somnath temple in Gujarat, and Ahmedabad. In Mewar alone, he demolished around 240 temples. Nearly 66 temples were demolished at Amber, and in 1659 in Benares, Farman, he prohibited the building of new temples. Destruction of temples and images were often accompanied by wanton discretion, such as slaughtering of the cows in the sanctuary and causing the idols to be trodden down in public fortress. In 1664, he prohibited any repair of old temples. In 1667, Hindu merchants were compelled to pay 5% tax, whereas Muslims were exempted from such payment of tax. In 1668, Hindu religious fairs were forbidden. In 1669, he ordered to demolish even schools and temples. Schools were the temples of knowledge. They were also demolished by him. In 1679, jizya was reimposed on Hindus, previously which was abolished by Akbar. Aurangzeb reimposed jizya once again in the year 1679. The petitions were trodden down under the feet of the elephants. Hindus who could not pay tax were converted into Islam. Aurangzeb also used to demolish the temples at Jaipur, whose ruler was in friendly terms with him. Converted Hindus got stipends, gifts, and jobs. That means he has allured the Hindu people to get converted into Islam in order to get economic benefits. In Udaipur and Chittor, 239 temples suffered ruin. Imposition of jizya to curb the infidels. He was a bigot, so he tried to persecute and to stamp out. His methods were sacrilege, economic repression, bribery, forced conversion, and restriction of worship. In 1670, the order prohibiting the employment of Hindus in the revenue department was also issued. He abolished the celebration of the Persian New Year's Day. He prohibited the cultivation of bhang and appointed muhtasibs, who were the religious censors in all the important cities to enforce the Quranic law. Restrictions on Hindu educational institutions at Varanasi, Multan, Tatta, etc. Hindus could not study fundamentals of Hinduism, Hindu children could not attend maktabs, the primary educational centers, and madrasas, the higher educational centers of Muslims, where Hindu children could not attend to get education. Except Rajputs, no Hindu could ride an elephant, horse, and a palkin. Holi and Diwali were allowed to celebrate under certain restrictions. Hindus were not allowed to cremate on the banks of holy rivers like Yamuna, Ganga, and all. In addition to that, Akbar was surrounded by musicians and court justice, right? Whereas Aurangzeb prohibited music at his court, gave up the ceremony of weighing the emperor's person against gold and silver, which we call Tulabaram, on his birthday, and also appearing at sunrise at Jaroka Idarshan. Hindu astrologers were also dismissed from his court. Let's move on to know the revolts against persecution policy of Aurangzeb. Before that, for your kind information, religious violence not only took place during Aurangzeb's period, even in the modern period in India, it still continues to persist. You are astonished to know this, right? Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch publish reports on acts of religious violence in India. From 2005 to 2009, an average of 130 people died every year due to communal violence. Let us know now about the rebellions which took place due to the religious persecution policy of Aurangzeb. To begin with, Jats of Mathura, they rebelled against him in 1669. First of all, let us know who were these Jats and in which part of India they rebelled. Jats rebellion was the first organized Hindu reaction against Aurangzeb's policy of persecution occurred in the district of Mathura. There, the sturdy Jat peasantry, under its leader Gokul in 1669, killed Abdul Nabi, the local district officer who was faithfully carrying out his master's policy of temple destruction and image breaking. This officer had built a mosque in the heart of the holy city of Mathura, and the ruins of Hindu temples had removed the carved stone railing presented to Keshavaraya temple by Dara, and had been abducting Hindu girls. The Jats killed him and plundered the Pargana of Sabadabad. After a prolonged warfare with the several contingents of troops sent by the emperor, the Jats were defeated in the bloody battle near Tilpat. Gokul was captured with his family and brought to Agra, where on the platform of the police office his limbs were hacked to pieces and his family was forcibly converted to Islam. Nevertheless, the Jats continued to rebel under the leadership of Rajaram Sinsani and Ramchera of Sahagar. Let us now move on to the Satnamis rebellion in 1672 AD. The next formidable rebellion was that of the Satnamis in the districts of Narnaul and Mewar. The Satnamis were a peaceful religious brotherhood who believed in the unity of God and were employed in agriculture. They shaved their head and face, including eyebrows, and were therefore called Mundiyas. The rebellion was due to a private quarrel between a Satnami peasant and a Mughal foot soldier of the local revenue collector. The soldiers' unbecoming conduct aroused the wrath of the Satnamis, and the quarrel developed into a holy war against the Mughals. The Satnamis fought stubbornly but were ultimately defeated. 2,000 of them lay dead on the field, and the rest were terrorized into submission. Let's move on to know the Sikh rebellion under the leadership of Guru Tej Bahadur in 1675. Aurangzeb's policy of religious persecution aroused the Sikhs, who broke out into a rebellion and eventually became an important cause of the downfall of the Mughal Empire. Aurangzeb, who had become emperor, began his policy of religious persecution, ordered the Sikh temples to be destroyed and masnads to be expelled from the cities. Guru Tej Bahadur offered open resistance and was therefore arrested and taken to Delhi, where he was asked to embrace Islam and, on his refusal, was tortured for 5 days and then put to death in December 1675. Aurangzeb's fanaticism and his deliberate policy of compelling the people to turn Muslims brought about an downfall of Mughal Empire and also the tussle between the Sikhs and the Islam. Regarding the Rajputs of Rajasthan, also he was not in friendly with them. The Rajput rulers from Rajasthan rebelled against Aurangzeb's religious policy. Among them, Aurangzeb encountered Jaswant Singh of Jodhpur at Dharmat in 1678 and he asked Maharana Raj Singh to pay the jizya for his empire state. When he resisted it, Aurangzeb attacked him and defeated him in Mewar. He also demolished the temples of Rajasthan, the states which were in the friendly terms with Aurangzeb. He did not spare anyone. He also faced resistance of Marathas who became his enemies because of his religious policy. Let us now move on to know the results of religious policy of Aurangzeb. It incited various rebellions. Aurangzeb became unpopular quite naturally because of his persecution policy. It weakened the financial condition, demoralized the Mughal army, spread lawlessness and disorders, and it became the most patent cause for the downfall of the Mughal Empire. As a conclusion, can say that the rebellious policy of Aurangzeb led to rebellions which destroyed the peace of the empire. In spite of his intellectual acumen, devotion to duty, and superhuman industry, Aurangzeb cannot be called a great or a successful ruler of men, for he lacked that supreme quality needed in every king, namely solicitude for the welfare of all his subjects. He had a narrow conception of duty, considered himself to be king of Sunni Muslims only, and treated all non Muslims in the country as inferior people as long as they did not embrace Islam. In a word, Aurangzeb's ideal was to transform India into an Islamic state. Obsessed by his narrow sense of duty, he labored all through his life to realize his ambition. But as it turned out, he labored only to destroy and not build, and consequently failed to achieve success. Let us have a recapitulation before winding the session. We have learnt about the nature of religious policy of Aurangzeb, the impact of his religious policy on empire, miserable conditions of Hindus, the people who rebelled against his policy of persecution, and his religious policy was also responsible for the downfall of the Mughal Empire, skill of locating the places where revolt took place. As usual, unless you revise, you will forget. Hence, I would like to assign a verb. Religious policy of Aurangzeb became responsible, one of the causes for the downfall of the Mughal Empire. Elaborate the statement. The books which I referred to prepare my talk are Medieval History of India by J.C. Agarwal, History of Medieval India by L.P. Sharma, and Advanced Study in the History of Medieval India by J.L. Mehta. Hope you would have got a very information in this session. Thank you, one and all.